Welcome, everybody, to the third episode of Conversations, a series of webinars about Israel, international relations and law, organized by thinc, the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation. My name is Anna-Rosa Schlechter, and I'm your host today. I'm really excited about today's conversation, which is about the conflict between Fatah and Hamas and the Oslo Accords. And we have today here with us two distinguished speakers, Professor Robbie Sabel from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and Dr. Kobi from the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University. Thanks so much for being with us. And our moderator, welcome also Andrew Tucker, Director of thinc. Dear audience, you may raise questions during the conversation by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to answer all questions. Andrew, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Anna-Rosa, and hello, everybody. It's good to see you all again, wherever you might be. This is going to be a very, I think, a very controversial and very timely session today. We've just come out of this conflict, or Israel has come out of a conflict with Hamas in Gaza, a conflict which is involves regional actors like Iran, particularly, that is resourcing and financing Hamas and other proxies in the region. So it has very far-reaching consequences. And we want to take this opportunity to think about what this means for the concept of negotiations. The US and Europe particularly are insisting that Israel remains open to negotiating with the Palestinians. And the core question really that we're grappling with is, well, what does it look like to negotiate if you're in the midst of a conflict, if you're fighting against terror? Is Israel obliged to negotiate? And specifically, what does it mean for the Oslo Accords? Now, I think we are dealing with and trying to promote the fair, balanced, and realistic application of international law in the Middle East. Professor Nolkamper from the University of Amsterdam recently wrote an op-ed in which he said, public international law is the only binding normative framework that's available for resolving complex disputes of this nature. He says it's very clear that Israel is an apartheid state, that it's conducting an illegal occupation, and that it is refusing to accept the Palestinians' right to self-determination. And in his view, the appropriate response would be that the Netherlands recognize Palestine as a state. That's an example of one approach to international law. Another approach would be Professor Kostaniemi from Finland, who argues that international law in itself does not provide clear answers to these kinds of questions. At the end of the day, it's really only political decision-making which can resolve complex issues like this about what is right and what is just. And international law provides, in a way, perhaps nothing more than a framework, even perhaps a kind of language within which to explain and to define and to implement political decision-making. So that's the context in which we're talking about these issues. Before I go to our distinguished guests to explore these issues, I'd like to just spend about 10 minutes looking at the context and the background of this dispute. And in order to do that, I'm just going to share with you a presentation. So we'll see if this works. Hopefully it will. Okay, so again, I think to understand where we have got to, it is important to go back and look at how the state of Israel came into existence and how this conflict with the Palestinians came into existence. Over 100 years ago, you had the Balfour Declaration leading to a number of resolutions by the Allied powers after the First World War, resulting in a series of mandates for the Middle East. including a mandate for Palestine. That mandate for Palestine was intended to enable the Jewish people to establish their homeland in Palestine. That was the core purpose of the Palestine mandate. The Arab peoples were to have Arab nations in Mesopotamia, which became Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and of course we saw the creation of Saudi Arabia in the same period, and Egypt obtained independence as well. Jordan was created, as it were, out of the mandate for Palestine. I think it's important to emphasize this. In 1921, a political decision was made to separate Palestine into two parts, one west of the Jordan River and one east of the Jordan River. And east of the Jordan was Transjordan, that became later the state, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in 1946. We had the mandate period leading up to the Second World War, and then the UN partition plan in 1947, after the British had announced they were going to depart from Palestine. That partition plan envisaged the creation of two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, with an internationalized Jerusalem. It was rejected by the Arabs. The Jews reluctantly accepted the plan, but it was never implemented. It was never adopted, and it was, of course, never carried out. But this is what the Palestinian, at least parts of the Palestinian society, referred to as the Nakba, the tragedy that overcame the Palestinian people was the idea of the creation of a Jewish state. Now, we all know the story at the end of the mandate on the 14th of May, 1948, the state of Israel was declared. It's a fascinating story. In the closing hours of the mandate in Tel Aviv, Ben-Gurion announcing and reading the Declaration of Independence, leading to the establishment of the state of Israel. And everybody knew that war was inevitable. And of course, that's what happened. We had the War of Independence. Israel was attacked by 5 surrounding Arab neighbors, and the war continued. There was, of course, already conflict, and the conflict came to a termination of armed conflict with the Armistice Agreement in 1949. But there was no peace agreement at that time yet between Israel and its neighbors. We had the creation of UNRWA, the refugee system for the Palestinians in 49, I think is also part of the context, which is important to realize that many Palestinians are still regarded as refugees, and they are supported and living within the UNRWA system. Israel became a UN member in 1949. We had the Six-Day War in 1967, in which Israel took control of the territories that had been occupied by Egypt, being the Gaza Strip, and Jordan, being the West Bank and what had become known as East Jerusalem. There was a tentative kind of peace, in a sense, for a few years until the Yom Kippur War in 1973. That was the last attempt of the Arab world to annihilate the state of Israel. It failed, but only just. And it led to a new era, I think, in Israeli-Arab relations. So very briefly, we had the Arab oil boycott coming out of the Yom Kippur War, a raft of Palestinian terrorism throughout Europe and many other countries. And this is when we saw the PLO coming into the international stage and gradually being accepted as an accepted player, and even eventually being the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people in UN terms. Throughout the 1970s, a raft of UN resolutions supporting Palestinians and the PLO, including the 1975 Zionism is Racism resolution. At the end of the 1970s, a new government in Israel with Begin and Likud leading to the development of the settlement movement and the Israel-Egypt Camp David peace agreements at the end of the 1970s after the Iranian Revolution. Europe, of course, felt excluded by the Camp David process and decided to engage in its own way with the peace process by issuing the Venice Declaration in 1980, in which it committed itself to supporting the Palestinian cause. And it said that that recognizing and resolving the rights of the Palestinians was to be a core ingredient in the resolution of peace in the Middle East. And this was the beginning of Europe's position in relation to supporting Palestinian statehood, I think. So a whole lot of things happened right through the 1980s, leading into the early 90s, leading up to the renewal of a peace process. I think after the end of the Cold War, we had the Gulf War in the early 90s, and then in 1991, the Madrid process. Russia and the US and the UN agreeing to establish a kind of peace process. And in the early 90s, Israel under Perez and Rabin entering into secret negotiations with the Palestinians in Oslo in Norway, leading to the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords is a series of agreements, the first of them in 1993, the Declaration of Principles, called Oslo I, accompanied by a number of side letters signed by both the Israeli leaders and the PLO leadership under Arafat, one of them being the agreement of Arafat to amend the Palestinian Charter. We'll come back to that. The second agreement was the interim agreement in 1995, Oslo II. And in this process, the West Bank was divided into three areas, A, B, and C. Around the same time, 1994, Israel and Jordan entered into their peace treaty in which Jordan distanced itself. It abandoned its claims, territorial claims to the West Bank and to East Jerusalem, and entered into peace with Israel. 1998, the Wye River Memorandum. And there've been a series of arrangements and agreements implementing Oslo over the years, and I'm sure Kobi and Robbie will speak to those. But very briefly, some of the main features of Oslo. First of all, we have to realize it's an agreement between Israel and the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization. The PLO being regarded as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. So it's not an agreement with the PA, it's not an agreement with a Palestinian state, it's agreement with the PLO, which is governed by its own charter. It's based on Security Council resolutions 242 and 338 involving negotiations, the idea of Israeli withdrawal from territories and non-belligerence on the Arab side. The West Bank and Gaza are regarded as a single territorial unit. As I say, there are three areas. Area A has come under Palestinian civil and security control. Area B is joint control, and Area C remains under full Israeli control. The Palestinian Authority was established, Palestinian National Council has been established, and many other Palestinian institutions. And the idea was there would be permanent status negotiations on the hot issues that were clearly going to be the difficult issues and still have not been resolved. Jerusalem, refugees, settlements, security, borders, all of these tough issues remained to be discussed and negotiated. Importantly, there was no mention of Palestinian statehood in these agreements, no commitment to statehood. Israel has never formally agreed to allow or commit to a Palestinian state. All of this was open for negotiations. The PLO is governed, as I say, by the Palestine National Charter. It was established by the Arab League in 1964. And the National Charter still, to this day, regards Palestine as an indivisible part of the Arab homeland. Palestine covers the whole of Mandate territory. That means everything west of the Jordan River. The Zionist occupation is regarded as racist and imperialist. And according to the Charter, armed struggle is the only way to liberate Palestine. The mandate and the partition plan are under the Charter regarded as illegal and void and lacking any legal or political significance. So this remains officially the PLO position to this day. And I think it's important to emphasize that despite promises, this charter has never been amended. This was confirmed in the recent ICC proceedings by Professor Eyal Benvenisti of Cambridge University. Since 95, there have been a number of attempts at agreements, 2 failed attempts, particularly in 2000, 2008, when the Arafat, I think it's fair to say, rejected the offer made at Camp David. And in 2008, a comprehensive offer made by Olmert to Abbas, which to this day, I believe, has never been responded to. In 2005, Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip unilaterally. And many other things have happened since then in the international sphere, including in the International Criminal Court. We'll come back to that as well. This is the offer that Olmert made to Abbas. And this is the drawing that Abbas made as he understood Olmert's offer to have been, which has been published. And as effectively you can see that Israel was offering almost 100% of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, a far-reaching offer which has never been accepted. Okay, there is some confusion, I think, at the moment about what is Palestine, what is the PLO, what is the PA, are these different entities? And this will be a question we're going to explore in a moment. But one of the difficult things has been that the Palestinians over the last decade have actively used the UN institutions to achieve a kind of recognition of Palestine as a state. And since the resolution in 2012 granting Palestine the status of a UN non-member observer state, Palestinians have acceded to many multilateral treaties, including the Statute of Rome of the ICC. And many states, over 130, I believe, have recognized Palestine as a state, even though it clearly, and this is universally accepted, that it does not qualify as a state under conventional international law rules. Nevertheless, we have now a complex situation, I think, as we've seen in this last recent conflict. Hamas is in control of the Gaza Strip. It has been since 2006. It does not work with Fatah. There is a conflict between Fatah in the West Bank, Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And now we've seen Hamas reaching out and gaining control and political support amongst the Palestinians in Jerusalem and the West Bank. I believe a recent poll suggested that Palestinians, if there were to be elections today, would overwhelmingly accept and vote for Hamas instead of Fatah. So I'm interested to find out from Kobi what that means in terms of the politics going forward. And the Palestinians' elections were to be held recently and they were postponed. This was one of the triggers for the recent conflict with Hamas. So without further ado, in that background, I'd like to turn to you, Kobi, first of all, to ask you, what does this conflict between Hamas and Fatah mean for the PLO? Does the PLO still represent the Palestinian people? Is it legitimate now to still talk about the PLO, or should we be taking a whole new look at this whole situation?
Thank you, Andrew. First of all, we have to remember that Hamas is not a member of the PLO. This is one of the causes for the dispute between Hamas and Fatah. Hamas demands to be part of the PLO, which is the sole representative of the entire Palestinian people in the Palestinian territories slash the Palestinian Authority and in the Palestinian diaspora. Secondly, I think that it is crucial to understand that the dispute between Hamas and Fatah cannot be understood as I would say a sole domestic internal Palestinian issue only. This is a reflection of the broader context which relates to the broader Middle East, where Hamas is a member or a component or affiliated with one axis or one camp, where the Palestinian Authority belongs to another camp. Since the eruption of the Arab upheaval, which used to be called as the Arab Spring, almost 11 years ago, we are witnessing a very bitter, bloody struggle between four camps or four axes, which are struggling between of them for influence and hegemony in the Middle East. And actually, we are talking about the Iranian axis or the Iranian camp, which is led by Iran, includes Syria, includes some proxies like Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the Palestinian territories, and Hamas in a way. The other camp, or the second one, is the Jihadiyya Salafiyya, which is the most fundamental, radical, extreme, violent version of the Islam. It is mainly represented by ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, and some other organizations. The third axis is the political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood, which Hamas, by the way, belongs to this camp. Hamas is the Palestinian version of the Muslim Brotherhood, or the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. This axis is supported by Turkey and Qatar, and actually Hamas or the Gaza Strip is the only case in the Middle East where the Muslim Brotherhood actually control, or they are a sort of sovereign or the ruling power over a territory. Okay, we used to have the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt under President Morsi for 1 year, from 2012 to 2013, but things have been changed in Egypt. And the fourth axis is the Sunni Arab Pragmatic Camp, or axis, which is led mainly by Saudi Arabia and Egypt. It includes all the Arab monarchies, the Gulf countries, of course, and the Palestinian Authority is part of this camp. Now, looking on the broader context of the Middle East, we can find all of these four axes fighting between of them for hegemony and influence in each conflict arena in the Middle East. And therefore, what we see in the Palestinian arena, and particularly in the Gaza Strip, is a reflection of this political struggle, because Hamas and Fatah are not fighting only between of them. Hamas is influenced and supported by Iran, by Turkey and Qatar. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which operates from the Gaza Strip, and by the way is more radical and more violent than Hamas, is a full Iranian proxy. And therefore, in the very teeny, small territory of the Gaza Strip, which is only 365 square kilometers. We find Hamas, we find the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, we find the Fatah, and of course we find Iran, Turkey, Qatar, Egypt, Israel, the UN, and some other players as well. And therefore, there are many agendas, competing agendas, and competing interests. And the eruption that we see from time to time in the violent cycles between Hamas and Israel are not only representation of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians or Israel and Hamas. There are some other interests behind that as well. We have to remember that in the Iranian eyes, there is a need to fortify, to strengthen the deterrence equation vis-a-vis Israel by creating or establishing three fronts that will be active fronts against Israel. And these three fronts would be activated simultaneously whenever Iran finds it as suitable in order to deter Israel. When Israel will decide to attack Iran, or when Israel will decide to cross any red Iranian lines, okay? And the three fronts are in Syria, in South Lebanon, Hezbollah, and in the Gaza Strip, okay? And Israel is challenged by these three fronts, and Israel has to be able to tackle the threats from these three fronts simultaneously. What we have noticed during May, the last military campaign, was fortunately only a collision in one front. I think that Israel prepares itself to the worst case scenario, that it will be occupied simultaneously in three fronts, or even more than that, because the Iranians are working also in Iraq and are preparing there the infrastructure of long-range missiles that could be launched towards Israel, and in Yemen with the Houthis, okay? And they have already threatened Israel that they are able to launch rockets, long-range rockets from Yemen to Israel. So we are talking about 5 fronts, okay? And we haven't spoken yet about Iran itself. So it's a very, I would say, complex picture, or very complex reality, where the Palestinians are, I would say, pawns on a checkboard. Now, the situation becomes to be much more complicated, because we are witnessing, not from today, but from June 2007, or even from January 2006, the last free elections in the Palestinian arena, where Hamas won the elections. We see, and in June 2007, after a very violent coup d'etat, Hamas actually gained full control over the Gaza Strip. They threw out the Palestinian Authority and their security apparatuses. So since 2006, 2007, we witness a very significant dispute, rift, fragmentation in the Palestinian theater. And since 2007, there were more than 14 trials for reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah, and all of these efforts, all of these trials actually have failed. And they failed because there is a zero-sum game between Hamas and Fatah. Going back to the explanation about the broader context of the Middle East, and the probability, in my understanding, that they will be able to reconcile is very similar to the probability that President Sisi in Egypt will be able to reconcile with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which, by the way, today they are banned, okay? They are illegal. They are not allowed to be part of the political game in Egypt. So this is a zero-sum game. And therefore Israel finds itself in a very complex situation where its I would say a preferable partner for negotiation is the Palestinian Authority, okay, which is an outcome of the Oslo Agreement. We negotiate with the PLO, but actually the PA became to be much more important than the PLO in the last years. Um, and President Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, is also the chairman of the PLO and the chairman of the Fatah movement, which is the most important political or most important Palestinian political movement in the PLO. So I mean Israel, we are in a very complex situation where our preferable partner is the Palestinian Authority, but the Palestinian Authority has no say in the Gaza Strip. Okay, we have to deal with Hamas there, but Hamas is a terror organization. We cannot recognize Hamas, but unfortunately, there is no other address in the Gaza Strip, and therefore we need the good services of Egypt and from time to time Qatar. And the situation is that Israel has to find or to crystallize a strategy vis-a-vis Hamas in the Gaza Strip in order to stabilize the situation there. But by dealing with Hamas, actually Israel legitimizes in this way or another, okay, the role of Hamas as the ruling power or the sovereign in the Gaza Strip. And due to the zero-sum game between Fatah and Hamas, by strengthening Hamas, you are weakening the Palestinian Authority, which is the preferable partner of Israel. Okay, so Israel has to deal vis-a-vis or versus two Palestinian entities which are adversaries, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and the Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and to use two different strategies, which are, by the way, competing strategies with internal, I would say, contradictions and tensions between these two strategies. And in order to add another layer to the complexity, I would say that we are facing a very severe problems with regard to the Palestinian Authority, because the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, and Abu Mazen as the president of the Palestinian Authority are losing legitimacy, credibility, and popularity among the Palestinian constituency.
That's very interesting. Yeah, because thank you, Kobi. This is extremely helpful overview and analysis. Can you tell us a little bit about how Palestinian society is organized in the West Bank? It's very hard to understand. You know, I understand it's got a lot to do with families and groups within Palestinian society, and who is driving the process of gaining. We've seen Hamas now gaining legitimacy in Jerusalem and the West Bank. How does that work? What's actually happening on the ground?
You know, this is a question that requires a very wide cultural and historical background. I will try to be very focused, okay, in this regard, understanding the limits of time and the attention that we have. The Palestinian society in the West Bank is a very fragmented society. The divisions, the rifts between the different groups among the Palestinians in the West Bank are very essential, very significant, and they actually face, I would say, severe difficulties in reaching to a sort of a consensus, okay, around, I would say, some leading principles in the national level. So first of all, the Palestinian society is divided between the refugees who till these days live in refugee camps, okay, in the West Bank, the refugees and the other Palestinians who lives in the cities and in the villages. But there is another division between the Palestinians who live in the cities and the Palestinians who live in the villages. Okay, it is very rare to find too many examples of marriage, for an example, between people from the refugee camps and the cities and the villages, or between people from the cities and the villages. Okay, but in addition to that, there is another layer of fragmentation between the big cities in the West Bank. Okay, we have Hebron in the south, which is characterized, I would say, by a very unique combination of religious and community and the nomadic community. Most of the people who live in Hebron district are Bedouins, and by the way, their tendency is not towards the Palestinian Authority, but towards Jordan, because they have very, very close relations with their brothers in the Bedouin tribes in South Jordan. Okay, so they first of all perceive themselves as Bedouins. Okay, and they are very proud about their heritage and about their history. Secondly, their loyalty is towards their tribe, their clan, then to the district, to the region, okay, to all of the families and the tribes who live in Hebron district, and only then to Ramallah, okay, to the Palestinian Authority. Now, they are very different in cultural terms from their Palestinian brothers in the north of the West Bank, Jenin and Nablus, okay? So it is very rare as well to find marriage between people from Hebron and Nablus. And in the middle, we have Ramallah. Ramallah is a very Western city, the most developed city in the West Bank. Actually, is the active capital of the Palestinian Authority, and there is, I would say, many Christians who live in Ramallah and the Ramallah suburbs, as well as in Bethlehem. Most of the Palestinian Christians live in these areas, but most of the Palestinians in the West Bank feel very, I would say, alienated, okay, with regard to Ramallah. Ramallah is perceived as something which is related or connected to the Palestinian elites that came from abroad after the Oslo Agreement. Abu Mazen and his gang, okay? Ramallah is not perceived as something which is authentic, something which is domestic for the Palestinians. And in addition to that, we have the Palestinian Jerusalemites, 330,000 Palestinians who live in Jerusalem, and they have a very special status, which is different than the status of the other Palestinians who live in the West Bank. The Jerusalemites, the Palestinians who live in Jerusalem are Israeli residents. They hold Israeli ID, which means that they have all the citizen rights that any Israeli citizen has, despite two rights, okay? To hold an Israeli passport. Actually, they have to use laissez-passer. And the second right is to vote to the Israeli parliament. But they are eligible and allowed to vote to the Jerusalem municipality, okay? And they are allowed to have properties not only in East Jerusalem, but in any place in Israel. They can live whenever they want in Israel. They can work whenever they want in Israel, and they have all the social rights in Israel, okay? And this is, I would say, a very privileged status that they have, because they have free of movement in all of the state of Israel, and free of movement in all of the Palestinian territories, okay? And this is a very unique community which does not affiliate itself with the Palestinian Authority and with the Palestinian leadership. They have a very fragmented political leadership and religious leadership of their own, okay? But Jerusalem is something which is very essential, East Jerusalem, okay? Something which is very essential for the Palestinian people, generally speaking. And this is one of the reasons that it became to be the trigger of the last eruption, the last operation that maybe we will elaborate on that later on.
Yep. Okay. Thank you, Kobi. I'm going to stop you there. That's been extremely helpful. I'd like to turn to you, Robbie. Thank you for being so patient. Against all of that background, this fragmentation, the falling apart within Palestinian society, what's your view on the Oslo Accords from a legal perspective? And do they have a future? And do you think Israel is bound by them? If so, what are the options for Israel, and what do they mean?
Thank you, Andrew. I think the Oslo agreements brought about a sea change in the Middle East. For the first time, we had the PLO claiming represented the whole of the Palestinian people, agreeing that the issue must be negotiated. Previously, the PLO, the Palestinian position had been that they would try and use force, or that somehow the United Nations or other countries would produce an agreement. Finally, they realized they would have to negotiate with us. And they undertook not to use force. I don't know whether they've actually carried it out, but they agreed not to use force and to negotiate with Israel and recognize Israel as its partner. By the way, Israel also made concessions. Up to then, we thought the Jordan would be the partner. Here in the Oslo agreements, we accepted the fact that the Palestinians would be partners. An interesting point of Oslo, which is not always pointed out, is that there's a reference there to the settlements. The Palestinians, the PLO, agreed that the settlements would not be within their jurisdiction, and they accepted the fact that there were settlements. It didn't mean they liked them or welcomed them, but they realized there were Israeli settlements there. On the other hand, Israel also agreed that the settlements would be negotiated on final status. In other words, there was concessions on both parts. The Palestinians agreed that the settlements would not be within their jurisdiction, and there was no restriction on building new settlements. But Israel also agreed that when we negotiate the final status, settlements would be one of the issues that we will be negotiating with them. There also wasn't a treaty. Treaties are made between states or between states and international organizations, or sometimes between states and bodies that control a territory. At the time, the PLO didn't control any territory whatsoever. They were sitting in Tunis. Nevertheless, Israel agreed to be bound by the Oslo agreements, and it's a binding. When a state undertakes to comply with something, it's binding on that state, even though it wasn't a treaty. There have been very serious violations of the Oslo agreement. The PLO continued to pay salaries and pensions to people committing crimes against Israel. In other words, killing an Israeli entitles them to receive a pension. If committing a normal criminal offense doesn't. It's a clear inducement to committing terrorism. And the basic agreement was that neither Israel nor the PLO would act unilaterally. We would reach an agreement. They've clearly violated this. They've declared a state. I don't think they are a state, but they've declared themselves to be a state, and they've tried to join, in some cases joined, international organizations. It's a clear violation of the Oslo agreement. Nevertheless, interestingly enough, neither side, neither Israel nor the PLO, has ever said the agreement is not valid anymore. Both sides behave as if it's binding, even though there have been clear violations of the agreement by the PLO. And finally, they're not a state. They don't comply with the Montevideo conditions for being a state. And what is interesting, the UN, everybody quotes, recognize them as a state. But Andrew, you correctly quoted the UN decision. It was given the status of a state. For instance, as a state observer to the UN, the non-member. For instance, when the Vatican wanted to be observer, they correctly said, we accept the Vatican as an observer state, period. The Palestine was given the status of an observer state. In other words, they have all the privileges. The UN, even the UN failed to recognize them, the General Assembly, as a state. Clearly, they did not fulfill the commitments of the conditions of a state. The last word I would say is the Oslo was conditioned on the fact that the parties will have to negotiate. If there's a big differences in opinion of what will be the final status, but we agreed to negotiate. And this is the key. The UN is not going to produce a solution. EU is not going to produce. The Palestinians will have to finally accept the fact that whether they like it or not, they'll have to negotiate with a neighbor. And by the way, Israel will also have to accept the fact. Not everybody in Israel is enthusiastic about it, but a solution will have to be negotiated. Thank you, Andrew.
Okay, well, thank you, Robbie. Well, that, to my mind, raises at least two very fundamental issues. One is when you say the Palestinians need to agree, then who are the Palestinians? With who are we actually talking? That's the first question, given that there's such huge differences between the different groups, as Kobi has explained. And the second is, I mean, isn't this whole idea of negotiations a bit of a farce? Really, they've shown no interest in negotiations. And I'm wondering if the whole concept of negotiations is not a kind of Western idea that we're imposing on this conflict. Is negotiations really going to lead to a peaceful resolution, or is there not a different way? I mean, I think it's a question for both of you, but first, Robbie, maybe you can respond.
Can I take the last question first? We've proved that negotiations do work. We reached an agreement with Egypt, which was a bitter enemy. We fought wars with them. We reached an agreement. It's not a warm peace, but there's a peace. We reached an agreement with Jordan, which also fought us. In other words, even in the Middle East, negotiations can work. On your first question it's a legitimate question, but we cannot decide who's going to represent the Palestinians. It's something they have to. We won't talk with Hamas. Hamas at the moment refuses to recognize the fact that there can be a Jewish state. They see the whole area as one Muslim state, and they conduct terrorism. The Palestinians have moved. We're still not there yet. Again, it might be nice if we had a liberal democracy representing the Palestinians. We don't have it, but that's their decision. They'll have to decide who represents them. And I do believe we can negotiate. Thank you, Andrew. Right.
But the different, I mean, Egypt and Jordan, of course, are states. They have a, for all their weaknesses, they at least have some stability in terms of their constitutional structure and governance. You know who you're agreeing with. But with the PLO, Israel has no idea who it's agreeing with. So how can Europe or even the US administration pressure Israel to negotiate with an entity that barely exists and has no internal stability? Kobi, maybe you can answer that question.
The situation is much more complicated than your description, because let's assume that the PLO is the sole representative of the Palestinian people, which, by the way, recognizes so not only by the international community, but also by Israel. And this was the Israeli partner for the Oslo Agreement, okay? And it is still the partner of the address for the further negotiations once they will be resumed. But the problem is that the PLO, the components of the PLO, and as I said before, Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad are not members of the PLO, okay? The components of the PLO suffer from absence of legitimacy. I mean, the last poll that was published last week by Khalil Shkaki, okay, indicates that Abu Mazen has 8% of support. Listen carefully, 8% of support, okay? Where Hamas has 74% of support.
In the West Bank? You're talking in the West Bank?
Entire Palestinian territories. But of course, it reflects also the West Bank. There are some differences between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but the picture is very, very similar. By the way, in a very paradoxical manner, the people of the Gaza Strip are more moderate than the people of the West Bank, okay? Maybe because they suffer from Hamas, I don't know, but this is another paradox that we are witnessing in the Palestinian arena. But let's assume that we are able to resume the the political process with the Palestinians, with the PLO. And let's assume that we will reach to an agreement of a final status agreement. Abu Mazen will sign on the agreement, okay? An illusionary thought, but let's assume. Who do you think will support this agreement? Where Abu Mazen has 8% of legitimacy of support among his constituency. So, I mean, it's not doable, okay? And in addition to that, even if Abu Mazen had 100% of support, okay? Abu Mazen is not able, not Abu Mazen, not the current Palestinian political leadership, they are not able to make the further mile, to make the historical concessions which are needed in order to reach to the final status agreement. The gaps between both sides, between Israel and the Palestinians, are unbridgeable for the seen future, unbridgeable. The maximum that can be given by Israel does not meet the minimum which is required by the Palestinians, and vice versa. And the main problem, the core problem, is not territories and not even Jerusalem, okay? Not borders, not water or things like that. The only problem, which is a coin, okay, that has two sides, is the historical refusal of the Palestinians to accept the right of Israel and the Jewish people for self-determination, which means that Israel, in any type of agreement, will be the nation state of the Jewish people, where Palestine will be the nation state of the Palestinian people. They are not willing, okay, they use the slogan of two-state solution because they are champions in confusing many constituencies which are not aware to the nuances, okay? But they are not willing to add only one word to this slogan or to this formula, two nation-state solution, okay? They are not willing to do so. And the idea that their leader, Abu Mazen, till today, doesn't recognize in the existence of the Jewish people. He says that there is no Jewish people. There is a Jewish religion, not Jewish people, okay? There is a people of Israel. What is the people of Israel? These are all the residents and all the citizens who live in Israel. And therefore, when he is ready to say, okay, two-state solution, the state of Israel and the state of Palestine, he says the state of Palestine is the nation state of the Palestinian people, and the state of Israel as the state of its Israeli citizens, which means that the state of Israel has no national identity, religious identity, national identity, okay? It is a very, fluid entity which belongs to all of its citizens. This is the core problem. And the other side of the same coin is the right of return, the idea of the refugees. Till today, they haven't withdrawn from their demand for full implementation of the right of return. By the way, they are trying, to make some maneuvers in the consciousness of people by saying that they understand the difficulties that Israel has to absorb millions of Palestinian refugees. So they will be willing to compromise on this regard. But first, Israel has to accept, in principle, the right of return and the Palestinian right to implement the right of return. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, once Israel, and I think that Robbie can explain it better than me, once Israel will accept the right, okay, and the Palestinian right to implement this right, we will find ourselves in a very severe problem in the coming future. But in addition to that, by accepting this demand, it means that the creation, the establishment of the state of Israel was historical sin. And they want us to take the responsibility for the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem. Okay.
Let me just jump in there, Kobi. Thank you. And I think this is really the core of the issue. And it goes back to your point, Robbie, as well about settlements. And I find myself, I also the paradigm that Oslo creates is the idea of the West Bank and the idea that somehow this is more or less Palestinian territory. But what's happened in the process, I think, is we've lost the sense, and I wonder whether Israel hasn't made this mistake of not adequately articulating and asserting its connection with Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria. Because that's the other side of the coin, is that what you're talking about negotiating with is the green line, the 1949 armistice line was a military armistice line which had nothing to do with the historic connection of the Jewish people with the land. And surely Israel should be asserting clearly its historical connection with Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, which are the heartland of the Jewish homeland. Wouldn't that be more helpful?
Andrew, can I quote Begin, Menachem Begin, in a speech he made to the Israeli parliament? He said, the Jewish people have rights and claims in Judea and Samaria, and we're not going to forego them. However, he added, and this was Begin, we have realized there are other claims and we're willing to negotiate. And this comes back to the point. Obviously, we have rights there, we have claims, and I believe Israelis are entitled to live there. But there are Palestinians, the majority are Palestinians, and we'll have to sit and negotiate with them. They'll have to make difficult decisions, and I agree with Kobi, they haven't so far been willing to make the difficult decisions, but they'll have to do it, and so will we in Israel. In other words, both sides will have to compromise, and it'll be very difficult, but I remain an optimist. We can reach an agreement. Thank you, Andrew.
Well, where does this take us forward? One last question, then we'll open up to Q&A. What would be your advice to politicians in Europe and the outside world, but particularly the Western world, as to the approach they should take to this issue? Should they be trying to, insist on this idea of negotiations, or should we be looking at a totally new paradigm for the way forward?
Can I take that up?
Yep.
What I think they shouldn't be doing is producing solutions. They can't produce solutions. What they can do is encourage both parties, in this case, particularly Palestine, sit and make difficult decisions. So far, the Palestinians haven't been willing, and I agree completely with the government, to make the difficult decisions. They'll have to do it. And here, Europe can be helpful. Let's say, if you manage to reach a solution, we can provide economic aid, political aid, but this should be dependent on you sitting with the Israelis and reaching an agreement.
Thank you, Robbie. What about you, Kobi?
I think that I would recommend them to be much more modest and sober, understanding that both sides are not able, under the current circumstances and the essence of the gaps between of them, to reach to a final status agreement. Therefore, we have to keep the horizon of the final status agreement, but to be more modest in this regard and to work hard for further interim agreements, okay? And to realize, to implement any agreement that we reach to. One of the main problems that we are facing for, 3 decades since the beginning of the Oslo process is the Palestinian principle, which is a sacred principle in their eyes, which says that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, okay? But there are many things since these 3 decades that were negotiated successfully between both sides. And we have reached to understandings and even to agreements about environment, about infrastructure, about economy, okay, transportation, and many, many other things that can improve dramatically the situation in the West Bank, okay? Because we have to understand that all the idea of reconnecting the Gaza Strip and the West Bank is something which is not less than an illusion, okay, these days. In this regard, we have to deal with another set of recommendations with regard to Hamas, okay? But talking about the Palestinian Authority, about the West Bank, okay? We are able to reach to a more modest agreements partial agreements, interim agreements that will build or will rebuild the trust between both sides that actually is gone for a decade. Okay, there is no trust between both sides. That will be that will create a new atmosphere, that will create new conditions, that will be a sort of facilitation for the negotiation for the final status agreement. That will take time. Okay, we understand that we need time. Now, there is a very dramatic change in the Middle East following the consequences or the ramifications of the Arab upheaval. And this is the new normalization process or the Abraham Accords or the new relations between Israel and Arab countries here in the region. And there is, I would say, a strategic alliance between Israel, the Gulf countries, Jordan, Egypt, Morocco, and even the Palestinian Authority with regard to the strategic threats that all of these components, all of these countries, all of these players are facing, which is, first of all, Iran, that makes all the possible efforts in order to undermine stability in the region and to undermine and even to collapse the pragmatic Sunni regimes, including the Palestinian Authority, the Jihadiyya Salafiyya, okay, and the political Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood. These are three common strategic threats. But this alliance, which was backed by the Abraham Accords signed a year ago, okay, this might be a new or an alternative framework for the resumption of the political process with the Palestinians as well, bringing the Palestinians to the framework of Abraham Accords, thinking not in bilateral concepts or in bilateral paradigm, Israel-Palestine, but thinking in a multilateral or regional concept or paradigm, where Israel and Palestine are part of a broader framework, okay, of a broader concept that includes, by the way, not only Israel, the Palestinian Authority, Egypt, Jordan, the Gulf countries, but also European countries like Cyprus, Greece, Italy, and thinking not about the Middle East, but thinking about the Eastern Mediterranean basin, okay? Now, when you enlarge or when you broaden the concept or the framework, it might be much more easier for both sides, for the Israelis and for the Palestinians, to make some major decisions that they are not able to do now. Why? Because they will feel backed and supported by all the other players, by this bigger framework, okay? And this is something that will provide them more security, more, I would say, self-confidence, more opportunities, economic opportunities, and some other opportunities as well. And only such cooperation, only such alliance, okay, or regional framework can be the right answer or for all the radical elements here in the Middle East, which include Iran, the Jihadiyya Salafiyya, the Muslim Brotherhoods, Turkey and Qatar that support them, okay? Turkey is another great challenge, not only for Israel, it's a great challenge for all the Arab Sunni pragmatic regimes here in the Middle East. Okay, Turkey is a very bitter and very dangerous adversary for Egypt, for Saudi Arabia, for the Emirates, for Jordan. The Turks are seeking to undermine the special status of the Jordanian in the Temple Mount, Haram Sharif. Okay.
Okay, so you're talking about a very different approach, a much more pragmatic, step-by-step approach, which is looking at practical solutions, which is very different from the Oslo model. Robbie, do you have a comment on that before I ask Anna Rosa to help us with the Q&A?
No, I would like to go back to what the Europeans can do. We don't need advice. And I remember reading a nice quote by Mark Twain, said the only thing to do with good advice is to pass it on. We don't need advice from the Europeans. We've got to sit and solve the problems by ourselves with the Palestinians.
Okay, well, that's a good message for us sitting here in Europe to pass on to our European colleagues. Anna Rosa, can you help us? We have some questions.
Yes. Robbie, actually, there's a question for you by Chaim Evan Sohar. And he says that you said the parties must negotiate, but Israel keeps claiming that it has no partners to negotiate with. And that's basically Israel's excuse to do nothing. And then he keeps going, saying that Kobi said that public opinion among Palestinians is that they don't support PLO. So why should Israel cling to Oslo? Maybe you could break that down for us.
It would be much nicer if we had a stable, democratic Palestinian authority that could negotiate with us. We don't have it. So we have to accept the reality. And the reality is that the complicated situation that Kobi explained, but those are our partners. We can't choose them. Their tragedy is that they haven't been so far willing to make the difficult decisions that they'll have to make. So all we can do is encourage them, sit with us, make difficult decisions, and hopefully they will do so. But again, you know what happens to prophets in the Middle East. Thank you.
But Robbie, if I could just jump in there, because
yes.
I mean, all we've heard is that the PLO has no legitimacy anymore. It's not being supported by the Palestinian people. So why hang on to agreements that are with the PLO that no longer represents the Palestinian people?
The answer always is, what is the alternative? There is no alternative. Hamas are not willing to talk with us. The PLO are weak, and everything that's been is correct. But they're the people who are our neighbors. And again, we have to choose to sit with them. We can't decide who's going to negotiate with us. They're the only partners available, and I agree completely. I wish there were different partners, but they're there. They're our neighbors. We'll have to sit with them.
Kobi, what do you think?
The best option for Israel is to replace the PLO with the Palestinian Authority. Okay, the problem is that the Palestinians will never accept it, because once they will transfer the authorities for negotiation to the Palestinian Authority, it means in their eyes that they actually gave up on the Palestinian diaspora. Okay, the Palestinian diaspora means the Palestinian refugees. And therefore they will continue insisting of keeping the PLO as the sole representative, even for the continuation of the negotiation. But as I explained before, the problem is that we are talking, first of all, about two Palestinian entities, where one of them, the Gazan entity, is not represented in the PLO at all. Okay, Hamas is not represented in the PLO at all. And the second problem is that the PLO is paralyzed, in the sense that it cannot make any significant moves with regard to the political process, and therefore we are pretty stuck. And this is the reason that I'm recommending to work in a bottom-up approach, okay, to leave aside the official negotiation with the PLO and to begin dealing with the real life, with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, bringing the Palestinian Authority, because this is an active operational apparatus which exists, okay? They deal with the daily life of the Palestinians in the West Bank, okay? There is a Palestinian government, there are Palestinian state institutions. They are not so functional, okay? They are not so effective, but they are there. They are there, and therefore we can work with the Palestinian Authority in the regional framework that I have described before, and this might create new conditions or a better atmosphere for the resumption of the official political process. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Anna Rosa, next question.
Yes, there's a really interesting question that just came in by Hugh Kitson, and he asks, given Kobi's comments earlier about the tribal elements within Palestinian Arabs, is it possible to bypass the PLO or the PA, which is corrupt, and reach a peace agreement with local Palestinians in Bethlehem, Jenin, Jericho? This would mean that the Palestinian nation would be more like the United Arab Emirates. So I don't know who would like to take this up.
Ready to refer to that. by the way, this is not a new idea. This is an idea which is very intensively promoted by Dr. Mordechai Kedar here in Israel, the Palestinian Emirates. Personally, I do not believe in political engineering, okay? Mainly when the political engineering is done by Israel in some Arab constituencies or Arab regions. We have a very, very bitter experience in this regard, not only in the Palestinian arena, but also in Lebanon. By the way, there are some rumors about the last events in Jordan, claiming that Israel was involved in together with the Saudis and the CIA, and we saw what the results are. But if the Palestinian Authority will collapse, and this is not an imaginary option, okay? Because till today, you know, Abu Mazen is 86 years old. Is not a healthy person, and he might leave the stage tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. It might be, you know, very soon, and there are no agreed mechanisms and procedures among the Palestinians for the succession of Abu Mazen. There are some figures among the Palestinians that are making the preparations for the succession of Abu Mazen, or for the day after Abu Mazen. And the problem is that each one of them has an armed militia of his own, okay? And this is, I would say, the ultimate recipe for the collapse of the Palestinian Authority and for the eruption of civil war there. Because on one camp, we have Majed al-Faraj, who is the head of the security or the intelligence services, which is the most influential or the most, I would say, significant security force in the West Bank. He is backed by Hussein al-Sheikh, who is the coordinator for civilian affairs between the Palestinian Authority and Israel, a very close figure to Abu Mazen. And they are in a sort of a coalition between of them. And on the other hand, we have Jibril Rajoub, and we have Marwan Barghouti, who is in the Israeli prison, but he has his cadres in the West Bank, which are affiliated with the Palestinian Tanzim, which is an armed militia. And we have Mohammed Dahlan, who operates from the Emirates, okay, but he has some proxies and some other armed militias in the West Bank. And we might find ourselves in the day after Abu Mazen in a very violent and severe clash between Palestinian militias. And this will be the recipe for deterioration and maybe the total collapse of the Palestinian Authority. Then, in the day after the collapse of the Palestinian Authority, the idea of the independent enclaves, okay, according to the different districts in the West Bank, might be realized in this way or another, not as a preferable or favorite option by Israel, but as the only option which actually exists, okay? Because we will have no other options but to reoccupy the West Bank and to go back to the civil administration that we knew until the Oslo Agreement. But I do not recommend, of course, not for the Israeli decision makers, to do it, I would say, initially. I mean, to initiate such a move, I think that it will be a very dangerous move. It will not be accepted by the Palestinian constituency, and it will create a very dangerous backlash to Israel.
Thank you, Kobi. That's very helpful. Ana Rosa, I see one or two other questions there.
Yes, actually, we have a bunch of questions, but maybe on this note, a question by Hans-Peter Buichi, who asks whether it was not a big mistake that Netanyahu did not expand Israeli authority to parts of the West Bank, since he claims the agreements with the Emiratis are nothing to rely on, to depend on. So what do you think about that?
So the question is about whether Israel should have extended authority, sovereignty to all or parts of the West Bank.
That's right.
To extend which authorities? To Israeli authorities or Palestinian authorities?
Extending Israeli sovereignty over.
Could I take that, perhaps, legally?
Yeah, there's a good legal question there, Robbie.
It's a good legal question. Both sides agreed not to act unilaterally. The Palestinians have violated it. Israel decided we will not at this stage violate it. So long as the agreement is thing, we will not act unilaterally, but hopefully we can reach an agreement. Can I add another factor to this discussion? Perhaps it might be a subject for the next Think talk, is the role of Jordan. So far, Jordan has decided it's not willing to be involved. However, Jordan is a stable state with which you have peaceful relations, and there's always the possibility that Jordan might decide to get involved in West Bank affairs. So far, it's refrained from doing it, but there's always that possibility. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think one more question, Ana Rosa, then we're going to have to wrap it up.
Yes. So there's a question by Peter who asked about the role of the US, since Robbie just mentioned also Jordan. So what role can the US play in all of this? Do you think there's a role for the US to play?
Shall I take that? The agreements we've reached so far with Jordan and with Egypt, I don't think would have worked out without the US support. US is the main factor here. It's awfully important that the US supports it, and the Arab states are aware of this. There's no other state in the world that can provide the political, economic support that the United States does. So I think the US has a role. So far, they're not interested in getting involved in the Middle East, the present administration, but that might change in the future. Kobi, I don't know whether you want to add something to that.
Yes, I fully agree with Robbie with regard to the importance of the United States, but unfortunately, we have noticed in the short history of the last decades that the American administration can be very, very helpful sometimes, and on some other occasions can be very dangerous and to create some very, I would say, severe problems. Okay, like the problems that we have faced during Obama administration. I think that the Biden administration is not the continuation of Obama administration in this regard, although it is not Trump administration, okay? I think that Biden as president and even Anthony Blinken as the Secretary of State, they are very experienced and they are very sober with regard to the possibilities, okay? What can be done in this regard. They are not so eager to resume the political process in the terms of Obama administration, okay? But on the other hand, they have already created some damage by, for an example, promising the Palestinians to renew the financial assistance, okay, for the Palestinian Authority and for UNRWA without any further conditions. Financial assistance that was stopped by Trump administration, and I think that it was right to stop it. Okay, one of the reasons is what was explained before by Robbie, the support of the Palestinian Authority in terrorists by paying them salaries and pensions. But this is not the only reason. The Palestinian Authority is deeply involved in incitement on a daily basis against Israel. Okay, all the Palestinian curriculum in the educational system, in the school, in the Palestinian schools, is something which encourages hatred and towards Israel and demonization of the state of Israel and the Jewish people, and support for terrorism. And therefore, I think that the American administration has to be very cautious in this regard, mainly with regard to the renewal of the assistance aid to UNRWA, which is a very, very problematic organization that should disappear. Okay, this organization has responsibility in the perpetuation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the idea that this organization is fully controlled by Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Okay, we have reached to such a paradoxical point when Hamas, okay, says that they are not ready to accept the Director General of Hamas, of UNRWA in the Gaza Strip, because in a media interview after the last operation, he said that the IDF operated very cautiously in order to prevent collateral damage. So they throw him out of the Gaza Strip and they say that he is a persona non grata, okay? And all the other people who work for UNRWA in the Gaza Strip are Hamas activists or people who are affiliated to Hamas. So the idea that the American administration will renew the financial assistance to UNRWA is something that cannot be tolerated, I think. So just in order to sum, the Americans have a very, very significant role. I agree with Robbie that nothing could be done without the American involvement, but the American involvement sometimes can be or can create some damages and problems as well.
Well, I want to thank both of you very much for contributing, for all your thoughts. And I think, you know, one thing we're realizing as we come to a conclusion is that the fundamental assumptions underlying Oslo need to be revisited. Whether or not you take formal action is another thing, but the whole foundation of the idea of negotiation with the Palestinians needs to be revisited. We've touched on, but there are so many issues we will need to deal with. One of them is the role of religion, I think, in all of this. I think another session we're going to have to talk about the fact that Hamas is an Islamic fundamentalist institution. Its goals and its aims are religiously driven, as are many others in the region. What do we do with that? On UNRWA and the refugees, next week, we're very thrilled that we're going to be talking specifically about the issue of refugees. We'll be talking with Dr. Einat Wilf on the War of Return, her excellent book, together with Ari Schweitz. And so we look forward to that. I want to thank both of you for your time and expertise. And thank you all very much for participating. And we look forward to seeing you in our next conversation in 3 weeks' time. Thank you. Ana Rosa, over to you.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
Thank you to all of you, and also to our audience for listening and participating in our conversation today. The recording of today's conversation will be soon made available on our website. And also, as Andrew just mentioned, we have a number of interesting conversations coming up really soon. So keep an eye on the website and on newsletter as well. So we look forward to meeting with you soon again. And for now, we'll say goodbye.